Hello, I am live at 7 o'clock for our unscripted conversation where we talk about mental health issues and I respond to questions in the chat as I discuss different things about mental health. Now, the questions in the chat or comments or whatever might exist will not necessarily be confidential, so I can't guarantee confidentiality. In anything, you can always say ask for a friend and no one will know because that's a trick nobody's heard before. Also, I'm not going to call people out much. I'm going to try not to anyway. So if I don't say your name when you log into the chat, it's not because I don't notice who you are. Every once in a while I do, but I mean, I kind of go on a little bit of like common sense on that thing. Okay, so with that said, welcome to the chat. We try to do it every 7 o'clock on Sunday. So 7 o'clock Eastern time if you're in that time zone. And we just have these little chats on mental health. So if you're watching this at another time and you're like, man, I sure would like to ask some questions. Maybe some of you would love to be in therapy but can't really afford it. So that might be it's like not really a replacement for therapy, but it can be at least a helpful guide in us having conversations about therapy. So with that said, here we are at the top of the hour, and I'm just going to start chatting about different mental health issues. Tonight, I'm going to chat a little bit about the shadow. So I put a preference on anything that comes in the actual chat box. So that's the highest priority for me, is responding to people that are here live. But I also try to, fill up the time in case we don't have a super lively chat going. So today I'm going to talk about the shadow a little bit. And this is Jungian. So Carl Jung, oh, thanks for the like. Whoever gave me that like, I appreciate the thumbs up. Carl Jung was a contemporary of Freud. So he knew Freud and they agreed on some things, they disagreed on others. He actually, I think, was like a student of Freud for a little bit. So, of course, everyone knows Freud with Freudian psychology, little creepy, a lot of sex stuff. But Jung had a very different approach to some of that stuff. He was a little bit more spiritual, a little bit more mystical, a little bit more understanding the collective unconscious and different things like that. But yes, the love to hear about the shadow. Good. So we're going to talk about the shadow because that's the most interesting thing about Jung. And for me, it really was a game-changing thing to understand what the shadow was and to understand how to incorporate the shadow, because that's the thing that is key with understanding shadow work, is how to incorporate the shadow without getting lost in it. Okay, so Jung has the psyche developed into different aspects, and one of them are the parts of our personality that we hate. Now, we're the ones who hate it. And so it's what we perceive as unhelpful or negative aspects of our personality. And we call this the shadow. So naturally, we shove it into our subconscious, which is one of the biggest conundrums of doing shadow work, is how do you deal with a part of yourself that you're not consciously aware of? So that's going to be one of the aspects that we'll talk about tonight. But it's really important to understand when we talk about shadow work that this is not your dominant personality. Often it's going to be the exact opposite of your dominant personality. So your persona, which is kind of that's the word for mask, right? Your public facing aspect of your life is you. It's not saying that you're being fake, and that's not who you really are. Reality is, human beings, there's no way around this. We are complicated creatures. We can be nice at times, we can be mean at others. So, like, if we use Ellen as an example, and I'm not diagnosing anyone in this, right? And people probably have only negative aspects of Ellen now, but like, she was known as the nice lady who talked about being nice and being kind and all this other stuff for a long time. And then it came out that she had this other personality that was very different. and was really mean. And so we were like, oh, Ellen is being fake. And it's very possible. Maybe she's a terrible human being and is true. I've never dealt with her. I don't know her. Maybe she's truly a cruel person that's mean all the time. But maybe her public persona is very nice. And the shadow version of herself, the part of her that she doesn't like, is really mean and cruel and self-centered and entitled. All right. What often happens with shadow work is that the people closest to us recognize the shadow and we don't. So like, we'll be like, oh, I'm super kind, I'm loving, I'm great. Like, and then the person next to us will be like, well, you can kind of be judgmental. It's like, what? Me be judgmental? I've never been judgmental. And a bunch of close people to us will say that we're judgmental. And we're like, no, I'm not judgmental. I'm, whatever it might be, right? That very likely is a huge hint to your shadow. So the things that the people that are closest to you reflect about you that you think isn't accurate. Now, here's an asterisk. They are probably not going to be perfectly accurate in what they say. So they might be saying, oh, you can be a jerk at times. That's very broad. What exactly is going on? What exactly is that persona? Don't get so distracted on the fact that it's a little off, but think about if people are reflecting something in you that you naturally don't like and you want to push off, what part of you might actually have an aspect of that? So I, use myself as an example because it's safe and I can, just self-disclose and still keep confidentiality with all my clients. But like, I grew up in a very religious culture, and where you see religion, you're going to have some people that are going to have the personalities of Pharisees. So Pharisees in the Bible were these judgmental. They really weren't as bad as we make them out to be in history, but they were focused on the surface level behavior. So they're all about behavior modifications and trying to force people into that. They thought they had all the answers, so that know-it-all, judgmental, and focusing on surface level things. One of the aspects of religion that I hate, one of the things that I have the hardest time with and have so much resentment about, and yes, an aspect of my shadow. So that's another big hint if you're trying to figure out what your shadow is what are the things that you resent in other people? Those very often, there's kind of this projection effect that's going on. Thanks for another like. I got another like. If you find yourself seeing in other people these aspects that you really don't like and it shows up everywhere, that very likely is a part of your shadow. So everyone carries a shadow, and what the goal is to actually incorporate the aspect of your shadow in a way that fits with your values. So this is the thing. One person was a psychologist, talked about Columbine and the guys in Columbine, that he said it's almost like they had a very dangerous and bad experiment with trying to allow their shadow to rule. So that's what we don't want, right? In dealing with your shadow, it's not like you're like, oh, cool, I'm going to be now in my shadow self and just allow myself to do all these naturally things that violate my values. Very likely when you're doing shadow work, it will feel like they're incompatible with your values. So when you look at what your shadow is, it doesn't look aligned. It doesn't look like it could align with your values at all. It looks like, and that's your conscious already thought this part of you is so bad and so evil that it couldn't align with the person that you ultimately want to be. So it's better just to ignore it. The problem is when we ignore something, it doesn't go away. It falls into denial and it wreaks havoc on our lives. So when you have an aspect of yourself that you're trying to pretend like doesn't exist, it shows up at the worst moments and in the worst form, and you don't have control over this thing. So this is where the two Carls come together. Carl Jung, who's the guy that came up with the shadow stuff, and Carl Rogers, who came up with client-centered therapy. Because Carl Rogers says that when I accept the things about myself that I don't like, they paradoxically and automatically start to change. What's happening there? What are the mechanics of that? Well, excuse me. Essentially, it is if I am dealing with my shadow, the part of myself that I hate, in a way of acceptance. Hello, welcome to the chat. Thanks for logging in. Um, if you're dealing with your shadow and you are accepting it, then you are in a place that you can start to manage it. So if you see this like, okay, I've got this part of my personality, I don't like it, but I'm going to start learning to love it. I'm going to start learning to accept it and try to direct it in a way that fits with my values. That's the key to shadow work. And so I grew up in a culture that really was like, we have these negative parts of our personality and they're just bad and we should just not give them any attention. We should flee from anything that is remotely around that darkness. And the problem with that is that there's usually an aspect of ourselves that we're not properly dealing with, and it will wreak havoc and make our lives worse. So we basically have unchecked aspects of our personality that we don't know how to deal with because we are trying to just deny that they exist. And we're thinking that the neglect is just going to make it go away, but it doesn't. All right, it actually comes back with a vengeance because there's parts of us are there for a reason. Like they come from very real aspects of who we are. Feel free to ask any questions, and like I said in the beginning of the hour, any chat questions I hold as a higher priority from whatever I'm talking about. So if as a child you learned anger is unacceptable, right? If children are supposed to be seen and not heard, then one, you might bury your anger, or two, you might stifle and isolate and withdraw from things. If you think, crying is unacceptable, so then you hide your vulnerability. A big one. Hey, Richard, the best counselor I know in the world. Thank you. Thanks so much for doing this. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that in the chat. And a reminder, I don't call people out unless they ask for it. Okay. So the problem is those parts of ourselves go into the underground and become our shadow. So this happens a lot with sexual stuff too, to be blunt, right? We think of sexuality as shameful, and then it actually starts to become underground, subconscious. And what can happen in the most extreme forms is actually a form of dissociative identity disorder, DID, where people that are in extreme forms of this will actually have it be where it's like a separate personality that actually becomes sometimes something they're not consciously aware of. So they can go in kind of monster mode and do all of these terrible things and not feel consciously aware of it the rest of the time because they've actually pushed it that much into the underground of their subconscious. So our shadow affects, this is a question in the chat. So shadow affects our behavior when in great stress or fear. Yeah. So it will be something that will show up most of the time in, high stress moments, in moments where we're sick or, basically not consciously able to be as present, right? For whatever. So we're tired, or just different things that trigger us for whatever reason, right? So those are the when our shadow shows up is in low and difficult moments. This is why one of the first things that we want to do in this moment is to slow down our thinking. So if we can do anything to slow down, to be conscious, right? And eventually it really helps to, I got another like, thank you, withdraw from the moment enough to be able to process through. And here's the key is to think, what is a way that I can not neglect that part of my shadow, but incorporate it in a way that fits with my values? And this isn't always easy. And sometimes it's going to feel like you're stretching a little bit. I mean, it'll always kind of feel like a stretch because you're trying to draw your shadow into the light. And so that's not only your consciousness, right, but your values. And so it might be like, okay, I don't have an outlet right now for the sexuality that fits with my values. So I need to just process and at the very least accept that part of myself as not bad, right? Accept myself as a good part of who I am and who I'm designed to be. Okay, we're getting some chat questions. I love it. Can our shadow be the reason we react to certain people in different ways than other people? Absolutely. So like if you've ever had someone that you're like, I don't know what is wrong with that person, but there's something that really rubs me wrong about that person. It might be based on a trauma that like you're in a protective self. So so like someone hurt you that reminds you of that person, and that might have nothing to do with their character traits or their personality. It really could be as surface level as bigotry of like the hair color or something like that. Or so I'm giving you two different examples. Or it could be that this person actually reveals the things about yourself that you refuse to see. So often we react to certain people in a way uh, that's angry because they are actually revealing something about our shadow self. They're revealing something about the parts of ourselves that we really hate and we don't want to have, as an example. If you get a chance at some point, I'd love to hear you talk about self loathing, the importance of self love, and some useful strategies on how to work on it. Well, in some examples, the shadow work stuff is the self loathing exercises in the deepest and most hardest level. Because now you're not just loving yourself as you ideally want to be. So there's an idealized self and an actual self. You're loving the version of yourself that you least like. So if you can love your shadow, you can really fully love yourself. You can really fully practice self-care. Now, again, all with this asterisk of you want to incorporate your shadow in a way that fits with your values. Because if you start doing shadow work and miss that aspect of like, okay, but how can this judgmental part of myself that wants all the answers and to tell people what to do be aligned with my values of non-judgment and loving people and giving them grace? And the answer is going to be, a little bit contextual, but there is going to be a way. So one of the ways that I balance those energies is that I accept these parts of myself and understand where they're coming from. I want to help. I want to see people get the right answers. Okay. So that's the aspect that then displays into the know it all, trying to tell people what they need to do in their life. Okay. Is there a way that I can still give a good guidance and direction for someone without manipulating and controlling and telling them things that are against my values? Yes, there is. Okay. So this is how I do, right? So that's kind of what the shadow work looks like, but it's actually helpful. And there's a lot of things in therapy that are really helpful when we start to like identify aspects of ourselves into a like image in our head, maybe even a name. So actually, a friend actually reminded me of a old exercise where I used to use this a lot called "Name Your Brain." And in the exercise, you actually name your brain to diffuse from it. So in other words, my thoughts are not who I am; they are a part of me, but they are not my identity. So giving it a name helped. And so like my name that I chose was David because I had a childhood friend named David who I love dearly but can be overly self-critical. So that's why I named my brain David. And immediately when I started to refer to my brain as David, it diffused me from that thought. So in other words, David is depressed today. And then it allowed me to use all of my tools that I have in helping others, because I'm somebody who's a therapist and really good at, helping people, on myself. So I naturally started to talk, even though I knew I was talking about myself, about David with kinder words and was a little more gentle than I naturally am with myself. So that it can actually be a really good self love tool if you start to name your brain. But you can actually name even different aspects of your personality. So like the little angry self that has that aspect of your shadow, and that's another thing that it's a good thing to be aware of, is you don't necessarily have one shadow. You don't have like one self, but there's different aspects of my shadow. You might have an little angry shadow, right? And then you might have a mopey, sad shadow, right? Of these different parts of your personality that you disassociate from. Okay, where we are. I do believe that the illumination of my shadow self is an important leg of the journey to obtain integrity. Would you agree? Yeah, I would say that, I love talking about the shadow because it was so game changing for me. It's not necessarily the first thing that I would jump to for therapy for people, but it is the highest level of integration. So if you want to become a whole healthy person that's truly at peace, I mean, we never get to mastery, really. I mean, human beings can fall into denial trying so hard to get into self mastery. And so, one of the paradoxes is that I think self progress is probably the dedication that we should make. Is like, I'm trying to become the best version of myself. Well, I'm trying to be a better version every day, is a better way of saying that, right? Because the reality is, if our goal is self-mastery, if our goal is to be, I'm just going to be perfect, or even the perfect version of myself, it's like, let's be real. You're going to wake up some days tired. You're going to wake up some days, sad, sometimes struggling. And if you're so focused on the goal of self-mastery, then it's too easy to fall into denial, and you're actually making your shadow self bigger. Integration, which is a word that I frustratingly have the hardest time saying, integration is really a better focus. So I'm bringing my shadow into illumination. And I actually have used it in the talk, the metaphor of Peter Pan. So Peter Pan has a shadow, like a literal shadow, and it gets away from him at a certain point. And it's like running rampant and causing chaos because, not surprisingly, Peter Pan's shadow is the trickster, the prankster. So think about it. That makes sense. So Peter Pan is the forever child. He never wants to grow up. And what is the shadow reflection of the forever a kid? Well, forever causing chaos. What was the Dennis the Menace, right? Always menacing, always punking, always bullying, always pranking, right? The trickster. So Peter Pan, noble, good, but childish, shadow reflection, trickster, causing chaos and pain. Wendy is the one who actually helps him catch his shadow and painstakingly sews the shadow back into him. So that's the integration that we're looking to do, right? And often it does help to have somebody else work with us in integrating the shadow, to somebody else reflecting, because often we need that mirror to be able to see our shadow. Our shadow is like right behind us, and when we look and it's gone, it took another angle, right? So it can be a tricky thing. Would the ego be the conductor for the song of my shadow? So actually, no. It would be the opposite. So the ego tries to erase the shadow or pretend like it doesn't exist. Your ego is always at war with the shadow, naturally, right? Self-love, or the highest form of integration, is where your ego, your self-identity, is starting to see your shadow as something worth having, right? So, say your ego is something that highly values being happy and wants to make everyone feel happy. And your shadow is, Mr. Eeyore Mopey. It's very sad, right? This is like the plot of Inside Out, which, by the way, is a Disney movie. Peter Pan. This is using a lot of Disney metaphors, I guess, today. I don't know is Peter Pan Disney? I think it is. But anyway, the psychology in Inside Out is on point. Okay, that is very valid in psychological insight in the movie Inside Out. And in the movie, it starts with joy running everything and trying to put sadness in its place, wants it to never be something that is consciously the focus, doesn't really see the value in sadness. And this is something that I see so many people want to be happy all the time, don't appreciate or see the purpose of their sadness. When, man, that sadness is so powerful, so healthy, it allows us to have connection and love. It truly is the evaluation processing of our mind is sadness. It's what allows us to recognize value, right? If you didn't have sadness, you would never be able to love someone. You would never be able to experience deep connection and beauty. You'd never be able to see value, right? You would be completely lost of everything precious in life if you didn't understand sadness. The problem is, using that as an example, is especially if you are over focusing on joy, and that's a huge part of your persona, and maybe you grew up thinking sadness was something that's like, oh, if you cry, I'll give you something to cry about. Don't, it's like, it's not healthy crying. It's not healthy feeling sad. Like, if that's the dynamic of your childhood, it's even harder to recognize that what sadness truly is, because it truly is love. Like, it truly is connection at its core. And you can't have that without sadness. Like, you're literally trying to divide something that is indivisible. It's one concept. It's the same thing as worry and purpose, right? Or you can, don't get me wrong, like, you can be better at knowing how to manage it, but a purposeful life and an anxious one are positively correlated, right? Those both go together. They're because they come from the same place. They come from truly caring about something, right? So I hopefully that all makes sense. So if that person needs to understand and value sadness in a way that still fits with the joy. So we're getting joy and sadness to like walk hand in hand in a way that fits with our values. Hopefully this all is making sense to you guys. If I can only learn a fraction of what I don't know about myself at a time, then I can never completely know. So, I mean, I think that you grow to know yourself more and more as you start to understand and identify these different aspects of yourself. So that's what I'm, kind of one of the things I'm talking about tonight. And I'll try to explain the shadow, and I think I did a pretty good job explaining it. And then I'll see somebody, if I'm being honest, like talk about it with themselves, and when they apply it to themselves, I'm like, oh, they didn't really get it. Because again, we as human beings are complicated, and some people are more complicated than others. So that's one thing that there's no way around. One of the things that I say to my clients that are highly intelligent is, when somebody is not highly intelligent, we call them simple-minded. And what is the opposite of a simple mind? What's the opposite of simple? Complex. So you can't expect to have a high degree of intelligence and not a lot of complexity, which means you're going to have different aspects of yourself that disagree with yourself. You're going to have parts of you that want one thing and parts of you that want another. And what we've found in therapy is identifying these different aspects of yourself, and helps you basically to integrate and to come to a deeper understanding of who you really are. When we look at self and self-identity in acceptance and commitment therapy, oh, I got another like. Thank you for the other like. When we look at those things, we use the word of self as context. And in some ways, this is a very unsatisfying but very honest reflection of who you are, because it's identifying yourself as something that can be very different at very different moments, that can feel one way one moment and another way another. And that psychological flexibility is actually the goal of ACT so you don't get stuck, right? So you understand and can tap into those different aspects of yourself. For me, um, I had a deep hatred for the Pharisaical version of myself. It doesn't mean that the best version of me now is a Pharisaical one. I still believe in the principle of non-judgment. But when the Pharisee shows up, I don't deny his existence anymore. So when somebody calls me on, hey, you're kind of being judgmental, my first reaction on its own, self-defense, my ego's reaction is, what? I've never judged people. I'm the least judging person in the whole wide world, right? Instead of going, okay, wait a second. I do know that can be part of my shadow. So is that aspect of me showing up? And how can I incorporate that aspect in a way that still fits with who I am? Love you too. Yep. Have a great night. No problem. So looking at that and understanding those different states of myself can be helpful. There's a psychologist who wrote, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. And so when we look at these parts of our shadow, right, we're trying to dissect that line of this is a thing, and this is where it's so hard because it's gonna be a part of ourself that we naturally don't see any good in. And we're trying to find the good in that part of ourselves. We're trying to find what's lovable about that version of us, right? So if we look at the really angry version of you, if you look at the one that is judgmental, if you look at the part of yourself that is sad, if you look at the part of yourself that is like wanting to do different things that your values and religions tell you not to, right? With grace and love, and go, where's the little child in here? Where's the inner child? Where's the healthy whole thing? What would that look like? And then what can I do in the circumstances of my life as it is, right? Because let's be honest, our life, we're not in ideal circumstances. We're going through different struggles. We're going through different trials. And so finding a way to integrate this part of ourselves that we see as dark in a world that we cannot control is something that takes a constant effort. So aggression can turn into being assertive. Anger is primarily protective. So it might be then about setting boundaries. Ambition, which could form into greed, can actually be an encouragement for growth or purpose, right? Sexual desire could be actually really about intimacy and being seen. It had this one story that this guy was having a hard time smoking, and he was actually not having a hard time smoking. That's probably the wrong way to say it. He was having an easy time smoking. He was having a far too easy time smoking. He really didn't want to keep smoking, but he could not give up the addiction to cigarettes. And so we were, processing that through. And I started to ask him about his very first cigarette. And eventually it came out that it had to do with his mom and resentment towards his mom, because his mom had been big on he should never smoke. And a huge part of the emotional reason that he fell into cigarettes and that addiction was this desire to rebel against her, right? And so my point in mentioning that is some of the things that show up as negative habits in our lives have an emotional root that isn't obvious, because on the surface level, smoking has nothing to do with your mom. But for him specifically, there was an emotional root there that we could trace, where we could get down to what was really going on internally. And we found that his smoking was a lot about his resentments on his mom. So we ended up going through a process where we talked about what his what his mom meant to him, and things that were good about his mom, things that were bad, and then through an empathic forgiveness process of his mom. Right now, his mom wasn't there for any of this. That's another thing that I find interesting is people keep thinking, oh, I have to restore a relationship. No, it's not about that. It's about what's going on in here. Right, that in therapy, that's always our primary focus. It's not about a relationship. It's about how we reflect and how we deal with those relationships. So we didn't need the mom there for him to go through and process all of these things. He did end up forgiving his mom, and he ended up quitting smoking, and he never smoked again. He just needed to get to that emotional root. So in some ways you could say like his shadow reflection of this cool smoking dude that was like a symbol of like James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause. You probably didn't know that. Most of you probably don't actually know the movie Rebel Without a Cause because it's it's an older movie. But this rebellious aspect of himself was really about feeling unloved and unseen by his mom. And when he forgave his mom for not loving him and not accepting him, and was able to give himself that mothering and energy, he then didn't need to fall into that shadow version of himself where he had to be the cool guy who's like fighting to be different. And so that's a good example of how you can incorporate this part of yourself that seems alien to the values, right? So it's wanted to be a healthy person, didn't want to smoke. It's like this, right? Didn't want to rebel, right? But what's really going on here was not actually about a spirit of rebellion, but really a desire for intimacy, to be seen and to be heard. And that's, like it all shows up in different forms, and the different forms matter. But a lot of it comes down to this deep need to be seen, this deep need to be felt, this deep need to be safe and to be loved. And that's why we find it again and again that the people that are in a safe environment where they feel really loved, even at the darkest parts of themselves, even at the parts of themselves that they think are irredeemable and so disgusting and dirty, and and we have so much anger towards those, even those aspects of ourselves can be redeemed. And so the idea of being that wholly integrated person, uh, an aspect of that eventually everybody has to deal with, is dealing with the shadow work. So that's different part of the shadow stuff and how we can reflect on that. I know I got people out there watching, so if you got questions, keep them coming for anything about. It doesn't have to even be related on the shadow. It could be anything about mental health. But that's what I was decided to focus on today. Let's talk a little bit about the shadow self and how we can recognize what our shadow is. So that's going to be through looking at who we resent and then asking someone that loves us and cares about us. Now, the way you have to ask that question, I should say, should be very gentle, and setting yourself up for not being hurt. So remember, these are probably things you're not going to like to hear. So if you go, hey, what do you think is, the worst part about me, or something like that, you're probably asking for a kick in the butt that might be very difficult, but you can instead very gently kind of introduce the concept of the shadow and say, look, there's parts of each of us that we don't like, that we naturally put into the subconscious. What is an aspect about myself that you see show up that you think I would deny having? And maybe even ask them to write about it so that you can kind of then later read it and not feel as threatened, because your ego is fighting against your shadow, like I said, most of the time. So it's really hard to do this level of work. And it's definitely easier if you've done some self-love, self-care exercises first, that you're at least loving the main aspect of your personality before you start to get into shadow stuff and try to love the parts of yourself that don't look so pretty to you. But those are the two main ways to work on shadow. Journaling helps in doing shadow work. And there's definitely different books and workbooks that you can go through on the aspect of your shadow. And it doesn't mean that the persona version of you that is conflicting in the shadow isn't still you. So it doesn't mean that you're being fake when you're being this. And honestly, I think realistically, I mean, again, I don't know Ellen, right, as an example, but she probably wasn't as nice as people thought she was before, but she probably isn't as terrible as people think she is now. So that's one of the aspects of, like, we keep looking for in others and ourselves this simplified identity that fits humanity, and it never is going to fully work. So if you want to come to an integrated whole aspect of yourself, where you have this really whole, healthy understanding, and you're the best version of yourself that you can uh, actually be, then you want to have a willingness to not be perfect, and a willingness to be complicated, and to have parts of yourself that contradict other parts. And if you can sit in that energy where you see, okay, and Carl Jung also talks about different aspects of the psyche. So the unconscious, the collective unconscious, and the enema or animus, which is kind of the if we're masculine, the feminine side of us would be one, and then vice versa, because that's where we get the concept of get in touch with your feminine side is from Jung. So there will be this like macho masculine version of myself, and then there'll be this very sensitive, feminine side of myself with this feminine energy. And if I want to come and integrate, I don't want to just integrate the shadow and my persona, which is the public, the dominant, the main version of me. So that dominant might be simplified as the helper, the therapist, the wounded healer, right? The pastor. The shadow reflection might be the Pharisee, the know-it-all, the judgmental, right? And then it's like the masculine energy, the warrior, the fighter, right? And then the feminine energy, that's the reverse, might be the empath, right? The sensitive. Understanding all these different aspects of myself and having a way to relate to it can be very helpful to basically understand what's going on with me. Why am I feeling the way that I'm feeling? Why am I struggling with these things? Where were my reactions? And then help me identify emotions and eventually get closer to self-mastery, closer to healthy, peaceful integration where I know myself and I understand myself. So hopefully that all makes sense. Still have some people in the chat, but I'm not getting a lot of questions today. So hope people enjoyed this kind of conversation about the shadow. But if I don't have any more questions, I might just end us early today. So I will give that couple minutes warning. But if you're listening online later, feel free to join our chats. Again, we're going to keep trying to do this at 7:00. That's Eastern time every Sunday. So you can log in next 7:00 on Sunday and kind of have your questions ready for anything mental health related. I'm glad it was an interesting talk for you. So I appreciate that. And thank you for still being here and listening, people that are listening. But I kind of have all that, I'll be honest, that I kind of could cover on the top of my head of the shadow stuff. So love you guys and appreciate you. So again, we're going to close up unless you guys have any more questions in the chat, and hope you all come and tune in next week where we'll have more unscripted conversations about mental health. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys. Always great info. Thanks. I appreciate that. All right. Well, like, share, subscribe, do all the things. All right. Yep. Have a great week, everybody. All right. Talk to you next week.